Okay, this tutorial is about the demographics of colonial America, and this is the first study in this unit where we're actually going to talk about waves of immigration that would hit the United States. As you can see today, the U.S. is a nation of great cultural diversity, but it didn't all happen at the same time. Various ethnic groups would come to this country at different times. And initially, our immigration was pretty simple, or our demographics here were pretty simple. While we're very diverse now, we weren't that diverse to begin with. Let's take a look at your outline and the colonial period of immigration. Underline this, please. It takes place from 1600 to 1830. And in the colonial wave of immigration, American diversity wasn't that diverse. It was mostly three groups: Native Americans, Africans, and a group that you're going to want to become familiar with because the phrase comes up a lot, even in modern day America, the good old American WASP, which stands for White Anglo-Saxon, which means English, Protestant, which means non-Catholic Christians. Now, we've been through the whole Protestant Catholic thing already, so you should have a pretty good background on that. But outside of Native Americans and African Americans, the vast majority of people who were here in the colonial days, all the way from 1600 to 1830, even past the colonial days when we eventually become our own country, are white Protestants from northwestern Europe, around the region of England. As a result, if you take a close look, the nation is founded on WASP principles. Our Constitution has a very high white Anglo-Saxon Protestant theme to it, as do our oaths. We swear oaths on a Bible. Our money says, "In God we trust," etc., etc. A lot of what we do is based on our WASP foundations. WASP males have dominated the presidency as well. The notable exceptions being John F. Kennedy, who was Catholic, but he was also white, and he was from Ireland, so he was pretty much Anglo-Saxon. Other than that, the only thing that John F. Kennedy hadn't been was Protestant. He was Catholic. We really didn't have anybody who deviated like really far away from the whole WASP thing until Barack Obama. White Anglo-Saxon Protestant, obviously African American became the trend there. Okay, now into the good stuff. I know demographic statistics are not always that exciting to study. I don't find them that exciting to study either, but you do have to know them for the advanced placement test, so pay attention. In 1700, there were fewer than 300,000 colonists. 20,000 were African American. By 1775, the dawn of the American Revolution, the colonies would have 2.5 million people, and 500,000 were African American. This is a pretty significant increase in both areas. Now, a lot of this increase is the result of immigration. 800,000 immigrants were part of the increase, but most of the reason for the population increase was due to colonists that were doubling their numbers every 25 years, with an average age of 16. By 1775, the most populous colonies were Virginia, followed closely by Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Maryland. And they were all coming for various reasons, as you can see on the slide here. A lot of times for religious freedom, other times for financial opportunities, or because of charters by stockholding companies back in Europe. Now, most of the population, remember, was east of the Appalachians, which is right here, something we went over in a previous lesson. Although some pioneers, 5% of the population, were west of the Appalachians by 1775. 95% were east of the Appalachians. And there were only 4 actual cities that were in existence in 1700. By 1775. There was Philadelphia, located right about there, which had 34,000 people. Then New York, Boston, and Charleston, South Carolina. This is critical that you understand this. By 1775, you had those four cities, but 90% of the country lived in rural areas. Only 10% of the country actually lived in cities. By the dawn of the American Revolution in 1775, colonists were still basically English, but there were other groups well represented here by that time as well. Somewhat surprisingly, the colonies were the most diverse society in the world by 1775, except for New England, which was still very Puritan and very English. And a new trend was happening of multi-ethnic marriages and births. The English were not just marrying other English anymore, or the Germans were not just marrying other Germans. Here in the colonies, someone who was English might marry someone who was French or someone who was German. Someone who was Scottish might marry someone who was Dutch. Someone who was Swedish might marry someone who was French or Dutch or German or whatever the case may be. As a result, kids for the first time were being born not just as Germans, but as kids who were German, Irish, and Scottish, with all of those nationalities in their background. Essentially, we were kind of the world's mutts, but in a good way. It led to an entirely new demographic that the world had never heard of before: the American. And the definition of what it means to be an American, at least in terms of ethnic background, has been evolving ever since. But for the purposes of this tutorial, let's take a look at the groups that were represented in colonial America in terms of our ethnic diversity back then, starting with the Scots-Irish. Now, the Scots-Irish were 7% of the population, mostly from Pennsylvania. One of the most ironic parts of the Scots-Irish is that they were erroneously called that. They really weren't Irish at all. They came from the lowlands of Scotland. They were Presbyterians who had moved to Northern Ireland over the years and had been disliked by the Irish Catholics. This is still a problem today between Protestants and Catholics in Ireland. It's known as the Troubles in Northern Ireland. The Scots-Irish tended to push into the frontier, often squatting on others' land, because the best farmland had been taken up by the Germans. Eventually, they made their way south in flimsy, floorless cabins compared to the sturdy German homes, but they became great frontiersmen along the Great Wagon Road from Pennsylvania to Georgia, as you can see on the map here. They also set up many whiskey stills in the Appalachian Mountains, and if you take a look at this map, the color coding here basically is the Appalachian Mountains. So the Scots-Irish settled mostly in the Appalachians themselves. Not in as stable a homes as the Germans, but they made their way. They spoke English, but they were not English and didn't like the British government, or frankly, really any government at all. One of the most notable Scotch-Irish groups were the Paxton Boys, who marched on Philadelphia protesting how lenient the Quaker policies were regarding Native Americans. Now, if you remember, the Quakers were very friendly with Native Americans. The Paxton Boys didn't like that. They wanted Native Americans out because there were a lot of Native Americans in the frontier in the Appalachians, where a lot of the Scots-Irish had migrated to. Another thing that you have to know for AP U.S. history, in addition to the Paxton Boys, is also the Regulator movement in North Carolina. This was also a Scotch-Irish group which protested the Eastern domination of colonial affairs. You can see the criteria for that right here. Eventually, the Scots-Irish would be a big part of the American Revolution, and about 12 future presidents would be Scots-Irish, although, again, not really Irish at all. The next group we want to take a look at here are the Germans. They were part of the ethnic background of the colonies at that time, if we're talking about colonial immigration. They were about 6% of the population, about 150,000, mostly in Pennsylvania. Now, the Germans were very Protestant. Martin Luther was German, the man who started the Protestant Reformation in the first place, and the Protestant Reformation took place in Germany. So it's very German to be Protestant. In the southern parts of Germany, around Bavaria, places like that, there's still a large Catholic contingent. But the Germans decided that as Catholic leaders started to become more popular in Germany, A lot of them decided it was time to leave and come to the United States, or to the colonies as they were called at that time. Now, a lot of German ancestry traces back to the modern-day Midwest. They really didn't settle in major cities. A lot of them became farmers or brewmasters in Michigan, Wisconsin, Missouri, places like that where brewing was very popular. Or they became farmers in the Midwest, either in the Great Plains out here or in the farming country or farming territory of the more eastern Midwest as well. They erroneously have been called the Pennsylvania Dutch at times, particularly among the Amish. The Amish are really German, but even some Amish people will refer to themselves as Dutch because Deutsch is the German word for, well, German. So they, instead of being referred to as Pennsylvania Germans, they have often been referred to as Pennsylvania Dutch, which is a total misnomer. They're not Dutch at all. They're not from the Netherlands in any way, even though some of them, the Amish, even refer to themselves as being Dutch. They had absolutely no loyalty to the British Crown, so they stuck to their own culture, which was away from the cities out in the Midwest. Colonial demographics would include other groups as well. French Huguenots, okay, so you had a small part of the population that was French. You also had people who were Welsh from Wales, which was next to Scotland. That'd be part of the other category here. You had some Dutch, about 2.7%. You had Swedes that made up about 0.6% of the population. You also had Jews that came over. You had actual Irish, despite the fact that the Scots-Irish were often referred to that. The Scots-Irish, remember, are mostly Scottish, or Scottish, if you want to say it that way. But there were actual bona fide Irish that came over, as well as Swiss and Scottish Highlanders, people from the Highlands or the mountains of Scotland, the only group with any substantial loyalties to the British Crown at all. The Scottish Lowlanders, people from the non-mountainous region of Scotland, had no loyalties to the British Crown. And also, African Americans were 20% of the colonial population by 1775. So the population of the new United States by 1789 would see the population doubling about every 25 years. By 1789, again after we had already become a country, cities were starting to grow fast as well, proportionally. Philadelphia's population had gone up to 42,000. New York had gone up to 33,000, Boston had gone up to 18,000, and Baltimore had gone up to 13,000. But it didn't change one significant truth of colonial demographics. After the first official census in the year 1790, there were 4 million people living in the United States, but 90% of them were still living in rural areas. Only 10% were actually living in the cities, no matter how fast they were growing. And remember, 5% of the population were pioneers living west of the Appalachians, primarily in Kentucky, Tennessee, and Ohio. 95% were living in the colonies, but still very rural even there. Okay, that's it. Thanks for listening.